shovel struck something solid. Reggie Thomas froze mid-swing, his breath puffing white in the biting January air. He'd been out there for hours, digging along the old railway tracks near Jesse, Michigan. Just another day on the job, routine excavation work for a new transit line. Usually it was nothing but frozen earth, rocks, maybe a few rusty railroad spikes. But this was different. "Hey!" he shouted to the crew. "There's something down here." The metallic scrape echoed as he cleared more soil away. It was metal. Definitely metal. Looked like a box, about 2 feet wide, buried maybe 4 feet deep. The thing was completely covered in rust, but as Reggie brushed off the dirt, 2 faintly etched initials came into view. That's when his stomach dropped. What they uncovered next would rip open a mystery that had hung over Michigan for 55 long years. A red brick house on Maple Street sat quietly beneath a layer of fresh snow. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimney, curling into the gray sky. Inside, the fireplace still glowed with soft orange embers, but Harold and Doris Chapman were gone. Their neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, was the first to sense something was wrong. The Chapmans' Plymouth Fury hadn't moved in 3 days. The mailbox was overflowing, and Harold, punctual, dependable Harold, hadn't shown up for his shift at the Ford plant. 28 years without missing a single day, and suddenly, nothing. When a sheriff's deputy finally stepped through the unlocked back door, he found a scene frozen in time. Coffee cups sat half full on the kitchen table, a plate set for breakfast, untouched. The fireplace was still warm. Doris's purse rested on the counter, $47 inside. Harold's wallet was on the dresser. His car keys hung by the door. Their winter coats were still in the closet. It was 5 degrees outside. Nobody just walks off into a Michigan winter without a coat. Nobody leaves their money, their car, their warm home, and simply vanishes. Yet Harold and Doris Chapman had done exactly that. For more than 5 decades, their disappearance haunted the small town of Jesse. Theories came and went. Search parties scoured the frozen woods. Investigators chased leads across state lines. But in the end, there were no answers, no bodies, no clues, just an empty home and a mystery that refused to die. Until a backhoe operator unearthed a rusted metal box buried beside those abandoned railway tracks. Until forensic experts pried it open and found a wedding ring engraved with 3 haunting words, HD forever. Until DNA tests confirmed what one retired detective had quietly suspected for 50 years. This wasn't a disappearance, it was murder. And the killer? They'd been living right there among them all along. Before we go any further, if you're a true crime fan, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss how this story unfolds. And while you're here, drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from all corners of the country. Let's keep this community growing. Harold and Doris Chapman weren't rich. They weren't famous. They didn't have enemies or dark secrets, at least none that anyone in Jesse ever knew about. They were just ordinary folks. The kind of couple you'd nod to in the grocery store aisle or see sitting quietly in the 3rd pew on Sunday morning. But ordinary doesn't mean forgettable. Harold James Chapman was 52 in 1970. For nearly 3 decades, he'd worked the assembly line at the Ford plant in Flint. Same station, same lunch break, same routine. His co-workers said he was reliable as the sunrise, steady, hard-working, and never one to gripe about overtime. He had hands roughened by years of labor, a slight limp from an old knee injury, and a habit of whistling while he worked. His favorite tune, Stand By Me by Benny King. You could hear him humming it while fixing the car, shoveling snow, or tinkering in the garage. Harold wasn't much of a talker. He kept to himself, nodded politely to neighbors, and often helped Mrs. Patterson clear her walkway after a heavy snowfall. Not the chatty type, just one of those quiet men who believed that actions spoke louder than words. Doris Marie Chapman was 49. She'd worked as a secretary at Jess Elementary School for 11 years. Teachers loved her, parents trusted her, and every kid at Jess Elementary knew Mrs. Chapman as the kind lady behind the front desk, the one who kept a jar of peppermints and somehow always had a Band-Aid ready. Doris Chapman had a smile that could ease even the most nervous parent on report card day. Her brown hair, streaked with gray, was always pulled back neatly in a bun. Her voice carried a calm, steady kindness that made people feel heard. She baked for every church fundraiser, apple pie, cherry, pecan, and her blueberry cobbler even took second place at the county fair back in '68. Doris was the heart of her small community. Where Harold was quiet and reserved, Doris was talkative and warm. She remembered birthdays, asked about people's grandkids, and sent get-well cards without being asked. But she wasn't nosy, she just cared. That's the difference people always made sure to point out. The Chapmans had been married 26 years. They never had children. Doris had suffered 2 miscarriages early on, and after the second, they quietly accepted that it would just be the 2 of them. So they poured their love into their life together, their home, their routines, and the little things that made their world steady. Doris tended the garden every spring. Harold built the bird feeder that still hung in the backyard. Their red brick house on Maple Street wasn't fancy. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a modest kitchen with cheerful yellow wallpaper, and a cozy living room centered around a stone fireplace Harold had repaired himself. Everything in their home had a sense of care. The furniture was old but spotless. Doris's crocheted blankets were neatly draped across the couch. Harold's toolbox sat in the garage, organized like he expected to use it any minute. They lived by habit, by rhythm. Church every Sunday at 10 a.m., groceries every Thursday after Doris finished work. Dinner at 6 sharp, pot roast Mondays, meatloaf Wednesdays, fish Fridays. Harold would read the newspaper after dinner while Doris washed the dishes and listened to her favorite radio programs. Life in Jesse, Michigan, moved slow that winter of 1970. The Vietnam War dominated the evening news. Nixon was in the White House. The Beatles had just released Let It Be. But in their little corner of Michigan, the Chapmans lived a life so quiet and predictable. No one could have imagined how suddenly that peace would end. The last time anyone saw Harold and Doris was late on a cold Saturday afternoon in January. Mrs. Patterson, their neighbor, waved to Doris as she brought in the mail. Doris waved back, smiling. Harold was outside scraping ice from the Plymouth's windshield. He gave a polite nod, his breath visible in the freezing air. By Monday morning, they were gone. When Harold didn't show up for his shift at the Ford plant, his supervisor called the house. No answer. He tried again an hour later. Still nothing. By noon, he called the sheriff's office. Meanwhile, Doris never arrived at the elementary school. The principal called. No response. One of the teachers even drove by during lunch. The car was still in the driveway, smoke still puffing from the chimney. But no one came to the door. By Wednesday, the mailbox was stuffed full. Newspapers piled up on the porch, half buried in snow. Neighbors started whispering. Maybe they'd gone to visit family. But everyone knew better. Harold didn't miss work. Doris wouldn't leave without telling someone. Family. They didn't have much left. Harold's brother had died in a car accident back in '64. Doris's parents were long gone. They had a few distant cousins scattered across the Midwest, but no one they were close to. No one they'd drop everything to visit, not without telling their church, their friends, their jobs. Something was wrong. Everyone could feel it. And when the sheriff's deputy finally stepped through that unlocked door, saw the half-finished coffee, the untouched breakfast, the coat still hanging in the closet, he knew it too. Harold and Doris Chapman hadn't left. They'd been taken, or worse. The deputy's name was Tom Briggs. He was just 26, fresh out of the academy, and this was supposed to be a simple welfare check. It wasn't. He stood in the doorway of the Chapman home, hands still resting on the knob, and felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. The air was heavy, too still, like the house itself was holding its breath. "Mr. Chapman? Mrs. Chapman?" he called out, his voice echoing through the empty rooms. No answer. He stepped inside, his boots leaving wet prints on the linoleum. The kitchen was to his left. 2 coffee cups sat on the table, dark rings staining the bottoms. The coffee pot on the stove was half full and stone cold. 2 plates sat neatly on the table, forks and napkins in place, everything set for a breakfast that never happened. Deputy Tom Briggs moved through the house carefully, room by room, his instincts telling him something wasn't right. The living room looked just as it should have. A crocheted blanket draped neatly over the couch. A folded newspaper rested on the end table, dated 4 days earlier. The fireplace still held the faint remains of a fire, logs reduced to gray ash and glowing embers. When Briggs held his hand near the hearth, he could still feel a trace of warmth. Someone had tended that fire recently. Maybe the night before. Maybe even that morning. He checked the bedrooms. Both beds were perfectly made, corners tucked tight like Doris herself had done them. No suitcases missing, no drawers left open. Nothing to suggest a sudden trip or any kind of packing. Doris's purse sat on the dresser in the master bedroom. Briggs opened it carefully. Inside was her wallet, $47 in cash, her driver's license, and a small grocery list written in neat cursive. Harold's wallet was on the nightstand. It held $32, his union card, and a worn photo of Doris from their wedding day, the edges soft from years of being handled. By the back door, the car keys hung in their usual spot. Their winter coats still hung side by side in the hallway closet. Briggs stepped outside for a moment, glancing at the thermometer nailed beside the door. 5 degrees. With wind chill, it felt closer to 10 below. No one walks away in that kind of weather without a coat. He grabbed his radio. Within an hour, the quiet red brick house on Maple Street was crawling with officers. Detective Frank Morrison arrived around 3 in the afternoon. He was 43, a seasoned investigator with the Yeezy Police Department. He'd seen plenty of missing person cases over the years, but most ended predictably. A runaway teen, a family dispute, someone found safe a few towns over. But this one felt different. Morrison walked through the house twice, taking careful notes, asking questions, absorbing every detail. He opened cabinets, checked the basement, examined each door and window. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no shattered glass, no kicked-in doors. Whoever had entered that house, if anyone had been let in, or they had a key. Morrison stopped in front of the fireplace. He studied it for a long moment. The logs had been arranged deliberately, burned evenly. Someone had built that fire with care, tended it, kept it alive, and then vanished. He flipped open his notebook and began jotting observations. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, no blood, no disturbance. Coats, wallets, keys, all present. Car still in driveway, fireplace warm, coffee cold. He underlined the next line twice. Last confirmed sighting, Saturday evening, approximately 5:30 p.m. That was their window. Somewhere between Saturday evening and Monday morning, Harold and Doris Chapman had disappeared. The investigation kicked off fast. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on every door within a 3-block radius. Did you see anything? Hear anything? Notice any strangers? Unfamiliar cars? Nothing. Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor across the street, told them she'd last seen Doris collecting the mail Saturday afternoon, with Harold out front scraping ice from the Plymouth. Everything had looked perfectly normal. Another neighbor, Mr. Kowalski, mentioned hearing their car start around 7 o'clock that evening. He didn't see them leave but assumed they'd gone to the store, or maybe to church. But the grocery clerk hadn't seen them, and no one at church remembered them showing up. Detective Morrison organized search parties. Dozens of volunteers, factory workers, school teachers, church members met at dawn, bundled in heavy coats and boots, and spread out through the woods behind the Chapman home. They walked shoulder to shoulder, calling out names that never came back. They checked old barns, empty sheds, abandoned houses, anywhere 2 people might have been hidden or trapped. Nothing. The Flint River cut along the edge of town, frozen under nearly 2 feet of ice. Divers were put on standby, waiting for spring's thaw. Tips started pouring in. A woman from Ohio swore she'd seen a couple matching the Chapman's description at a rest stop. Officers drove 3 hours to check it out. Wrong couple. Then a man in Illinois called in, claiming he'd spotted a Plymouth Fury that looked exactly like Harold's. Another dead end. Every lead fizzled. Every hope turned cold, just like the Michigan winter that had swallowed the Chapmans whole. Then came one of those calls detectives hate but can't ignore. A psychic from Detroit claimed she'd had a vision of the Chapmans, said she saw them alive, living in a cabin up north. Detective Morrison didn't believe in psychics, but at that point, he couldn't rule anything out. He sent 2 officers to check it out. The cabin was empty, dust thick on the floor, no footprints, no signs of life. It hadn't been used in years. Weeks turned into months. By spring, the ice finally broke on the Flint River. Divers went in, searching the dark water for any trace, a car, a body, a clue, anything. But the river kept its secrets. Harold's paycheck still sat uncashed at the Ford plant. Doris's position at the school was quietly filled by a substitute who, after a while, just became permanent. The red brick house on Maple Street sat empty. A for sale sign went up in the yard, posted by a distant cousin who'd inherited the property. The laughter, the warmth, the life that had filled those rooms, gone. Meanwhile, the case file kept growing. More interviews, more reports, more dead ends. Detective Morrison couldn't let it go. Long after his team had gone home for the night, he'd sit in his office under the hum of a desk lamp, staring at the photos, the coffee cups, the untouched breakfast, the warm fireplace, the coat still hanging neatly in the closet. Something about it gnawed at him. This wasn't random. This wasn't some drifter or burglar who stumbled into the wrong house. This was planned. Someone had known the Chapmans, known their habits, their weekend routines. Someone they trusted enough to open the door for. So Morrison made a list. Everyone with access to the house. Everyone who knew them well enough to walk in without raising suspicion. Family, none nearby. Co-workers, all checked, all cleared. Church members, dozens interviewed, not a hint of anything unusual. Then he got to the neighbors. Morrison paused, pen hovering over the page. He flipped back through his notes until he found the name he was looking for. 28 years old, lived 3 houses down, worked maintenance on the railway, single, quiet, reliable, and had a set of keys to the Chapman's house. Morrison had spoken with him weeks after the disappearance. Dawson had been calm, cooperative, said he hadn't seen Harold or Doris lately, figured they'd gone to visit family. But the Chapmans didn't have family. Morrison circled Dawson's name and scribbled in the margin, "Follow up." But without evidence, without probable cause, his gut feeling wasn't enough. By the summer of 1971, the investigation was officially cold. The Chapman file was boxed up, labeled, and shelved in the basement of the Yacy Police Department. One folder among dozens of unsolved mysteries. Morrison retired in 1975, but when he cleaned out his desk, he didn't leave the case behind. He took copies of everything, photos, reports, witness statements, and set them up in his basement at home, pinned neatly to a corkboard. For 55 years, the mystery of Harold and Doris Chapman sat unsolved, until a backhoe operator named Reggie Thomas hit a rusted metal box buried 4 feet deep beside the old railway tracks. Inside, forensic teams found bones, fabric, and a wedding ring engraved with 3 words that stopped everyone cold. HD forever. The truth was finally coming to light. Quick break, folks. If this story has you hooked like it did me, hit that like button. It helps us keep telling stories like this. And tell me in the comments, what time is it where you're watching from? I love seeing who's tuning in across the country. Frank Morrison couldn't sleep. It was 1975, 5 years after the Chapmans vanished. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the clock reading 2 a.m., his mind back in that cold little house on Maple Street. Beside him, his wife stirred. "Frank," Margaret murmured sleepily, "you're doing it again." Doing what? Thinking about them. He didn't deny it. Morrison had been retired from the Yacy Police Department for 3 months now, 25 years on the force. His colleagues had thrown him a retirement party. The captain gave a kind speech about his service and dedication. His kids bought him a new fishing rod. By all accounts, he'd earned a rest. But it didn't feel like rest. It felt like unfinished business, like failure, because Harold and Doris Chapman were still missing, still unsolved, still haunting him. He'd brought home copies of the entire case, the reports, the photos, the statements, the maps. In his basement, he set up a small workspace, pinned everything to a corkboard, drawing lines between names, dates, and places. At first, Margaret didn't say much. She understood. Margaret Morrison had been married to a cop long enough to know some cases just don't let go of you. But as the weeks turned into months, she started to realize this one had its hooks in Frank deeper than any other. He spent more time in the basement than anywhere else. The coffee would go cold on his desk. The lights stayed on long after midnight. One evening, she stood at the top of the stairs, watching him shuffle through stacks of papers, his hair thinning, his eyes tired. "Frank," she said softly, "you've got to let it go." He didn't even look up. "I can't." "Why not?" He finally met her eyes. And in that moment, she saw just how much the case had taken from him. "Because," he said quietly, "someone got away with it." That was the truth Morrison couldn't live with. Someone had murdered Harold and Doris Chapman. Someone had walked into their home, ended their lives, and vanished. And that someone was still out there, living freely, maybe even sleeping peacefully, while two innocent people had been erased from the world. It ate at him. What haunted Morrison most weren't just the unanswered questions. It was the details that didn't fit. He kept coming back to the fireplace. The logs had been arranged carefully, burned evenly, tended recently. Who builds a fire right before disappearing? Who takes the time to stoke the flames and add fresh wood, then walks out into freezing air without even a coat? No one, unless someone else had built that fire, unless someone wanted it to look like the Chapmans had just stepped out for a moment. Then there were the coffee cups, two of them, half full, gone cold. Plates set out for breakfast, the scene frozen mid-morning, mid-life. It didn't look like a couple preparing to leave. It looked like they'd been interrupted, surprised, by someone they knew. And then there were the coats. Morrison checked the weather records for that weekend. The numbers were brutal. Saturday night dropped to 3 degrees. Sunday morning, -2. Wind chill made it feel like 15 below. No one survives that kind of cold without proper clothing. So either the Chapmans walked out voluntarily and froze to death within minutes, or they never walked out at all. Morrison believed the latter. They'd been killed in that house, or taken from it by force. And whoever did it had keys, because there was no sign of forced entry. No broken windows, no damaged locks, nothing. Whoever entered that home was either let in or already had access. Morrison pulled out his old list, the same one he'd made in 1971, and ran his finger down the names again. Everyone who had keys to the Chapman home. There was only one name, 28 years old at the time, lived 3 houses down on Maple Street, railway maintenance worker, single, quiet, kept to himself. The Chapmans had trusted him. They'd given him a spare key so he could feed their cat or water the plants when they traveled. Harold had helped him shovel snow. Doris once baked him a pie to thank him for being a good neighbor. Morrison had interviewed Dawson twice, once in February of 1970 and again that April. Both times, Dawson was polite, calm, even helpful. Said he hadn't seen the Chapmans in a few days, figured they'd gone to visit family, but they didn't have family. Morrison had noted that inconsistency, but without hard evidence, it wasn't enough. A gut feeling doesn't hold up in court. So he watched, quietly, unofficially. He drove by Dawson's house now and then, saw him leaving for work, coming home, mowing his lawn. Just another man living his life. Nothing suspicious. Then in 1972, Dawson moved, packed up and left Genesee, relocated to Grand Rapids, 2 years after the Chapmans vanished. Coincidence? Maybe. But Morrison didn't believe in coincidences. Over the next 5 decades, Morrison never truly let the case go. In the 1980s, he tracked down old neighbors who'd moved away, re-interviewed them, hoping time had loosened their memories. Most remembered nothing unusual about Dawson. A few described him as quiet, awkward, kept odd hours. But one, Mrs. Callahan, recalled something strange. She'd seen Dawson loading something into his truck one night in January of 1970. A large bundle wrapped in a canvas tarp. She'd assumed it was work equipment, tools maybe. But when Morrison checked the timing, it lined up almost perfectly with the weekend the Chapmans disappeared. He wrote it down, added it to the file. By the 1990s, Morrison's investigation had gone far beyond Genesee. He began studying similar cold cases across the Midwest, looking for patterns, connections, anything that might point back to Calvin Dawson. Frank Morrison had spent decades chasing shadows, unsolved disappearances, missing couples, stories that ended in question marks instead of periods. He went to conferences, swapped theories with other retired detectives, compared case notes. Nothing lined up perfectly, but the patterns were always there. Trust, access, opportunity. By the early 2000s, Frank had learned how to use a computer, thanks to his grandkids, who were thrilled to show him how to scan old files and type without poking each key like it might bite. He digitized everything, built spreadsheets, cross-referenced employment records from the old railway yard. That's when it clicked. Calvin Dawson had worked the night shift in 1970. He had access to heavy equipment, maintenance vehicles, and enough open ground to hide almost anything, or anyone. Frank was 75 then, and still chasing a ghost. His wife, Margaret, passed away in 2003 after a long fight with cancer. In her final days, she'd taken his hand and said softly, "Still thinking about that couple, aren't you?" He'd nodded. She'd smiled faintly. "I hope you find them, Frank. I hope you get your answer he never did. At least not while she was alive." His children worried. In 2008, they staged what they called an intervention. They sat him down and told him he had to let it go, that it was consuming him, that he was 91 years old and deserved peace. Frank listened quietly, thanked them for caring, and then went right back to his files. Because to him, this wasn't obsession. It wasn't pride. It was duty. Harold and Doris Chapman deserved someone who wouldn't forget them, someone who wouldn't stop looking. And Frank Morrison refused to walk away. Every year on the anniversary of their disappearance, he called the Michigan State Police Cold Case Unit, left messages, sent letters, reminded them that the Chapmans were still out there somewhere, still waiting. Most years no one called him back, but that didn't stop him. In 2020, at 93, Frank finally moved into an assisted living facility. His kids insisted. His knees were bad, his eyesight worse, and his hands trembled too much to write clearly anymore. But his mind, sharp as ever. He brought his boxes of files with him. The staff didn't quite know what to make of the old man in room 12, who spent hours each day poring over police reports yellowed by time. But Frank didn't care. He had a theory, and he was certain it was right. Calvin Dawson had murdered Harold and Doris Chapman. He'd taken their money, buried their bodies near the railway yard, and lived the rest of his life pretending it never happened. Frank had written everything down in a leather-bound notebook. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but his conviction was clear. On the very first page, in shaky handwriting, he'd written. Then one cold morning in January 2025, his phone rang. It was a detective from the Michigan State Police, a woman named Sarah Hang. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "I'm calling about the Chapman case." Frank's heart stopped. Then she said the words he'd waited a lifetime to hear. Reggie Thomas had been in excavation for 15 years. He dug up just about everything: old bottles, rusted car parts, once even a Civil War-era bayonet that wound up in a local museum. But he'd never found a body. It was Tuesday morning, January 14th, 2025. The sky was gray, the kind of gray that makes cold feel even colder. Reggie was 3 hours into his shift when his backhoe struck something solid. The site sat along a stretch of abandoned railway tracks on the edge of Genesee. The Michigan Department of Transportation was clearing the land for a new transit line. Mostly it was routine work: dirt, gravel, weeds, and the occasional scrap of old rail metal. But this was different. The bucket scraped across something hard and hollow. Reggie stopped the machine, climbed down, and began to dig by hand. His shovel hit metal again. He crouched, brushed away the dirt with gloved hands. A box, rectangular, maybe 2 by 3 feet. Rusted, corroded, but intact. And etched faintly into the top, 2 letters, initials. Reggie stepped back, heart thudding, and called out to his supervisor, "You're going to want to see this." Within 20 minutes, the site was shut down. Within an hour, the police were there. Within 2 hours, the Michigan State Police Cold Case Unit had arrived. Detective Sarah Hang, 38 years old, sharp-eyed and steady as they come, stood at the edge of the dig site, her breath fogging in the cold. She'd spent 5 years chasing long-forgotten crimes, and she'd seen just about everything. Shallow graves, bones scattered by animals, remains lost to time. But this was different. This felt intentional. The metal box had been buried 4 feet down, wrapped in what was left of a canvas tarp. It was hidden in a patch of land that, back in the 1970s, had been active railway property. But by the mid-80s, the line was abandoned, left to weeds and rust. Whoever buried it here had known exactly what they were doing. They'd picked a spot no one would think to disturb. Hang crouched beside the box, studying the corroded surface. The initials carved deep into the metal were still visible despite the decades of decay. She pulled on latex gloves and motioned for the forensic team. "Let's open it," she said quietly. They worked slowly, carefully, easing the lid loose. The hinges groaned, rusted tight from 55 Michigan winters underground. And then, the lid gave way. The smell hit first, faint but unmistakable. Old death. Inside were fragments wrapped in shredded fabric, bones, a skull with a fracture at the back, ribs, a pelvis, and nestled among them, a ring. Hang leaned closer, the cold air stinging her face. The ring was gold, tarnished but still whole. She turned it gently in her gloved hand. Engraved inside were 4 simple words, HD forever. Her pulse quickened. "Bag this," she told the tech beside her, "and catalog everything in this box immediately." As her team worked, Hang stood and scanned the site. If one body was here, she thought, there might be another. "Bring in the ground-penetrating radar," she ordered. "Sweep a 50-foot radius." 3 hours later, the second signal came through. 10 feet east of the first burial site. No box this time, just burlap, frayed and damp, barely holding together. They dug carefully, layer by layer. A man's remains. Early 50s, blunt force trauma to the skull. Hang didn't need dental records to know who he was. And the woman in the box, the one with the engraved ring, was Doris. 55 years. They'd been buried here, side by side, hidden beneath the same frozen ground that once carried freight trains and factory workers. Hang pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. She found the name she'd been waiting for. Retired detective, 98 years old, living in assisted care. She'd read his files, every page, every note. 5 years ago, he'd donated everything to the state police archives, hoping someone, anyone, would pick up where he left off. She dialed. The phone rang twice before a nurse answered. "Willowbrook Assisted Living, how can I help you?" "This is Detective Sarah Hang, Michigan State Police. I need to speak with Frank Morrison. It's urgent. It's about a case he worked in 1970. A pause, then, "Hold on." Hang waited, heart pounding. A moment later, a thin, fragile voice came on the line. "This is Frank Morrison. Mr. Morrison, my name is Detective Sarah Hang. I'm with the Cold Case Unit. I'm calling about Harold and Doris Chapman." There was silence, then, barely above a whisper, "You found them?" "Yes, sir," she said softly. "We found them." She could hear his breath hitch. 55 years of waiting, of hoping, of refusing to let go, all collapsing into that single, trembling exhale. "Both of them?" he asked. "Both." A long pause followed, then a sound, half laugh, half sob. "I knew it," he said. "I knew it was someone with access to that yard." Hang looked over at the excavation site, where the forensic team worked carefully in the dim winter light. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "I've read your notes. You had a suspect, Calvin Dawson." "Yes," Morrison said, his voice steadier now. "Did you find him?" "Not yet," Hang said, "but we will." Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Then slowly, "He had keys to their house. Worked nights on the railway. He knew their schedule. I interviewed him twice. Something always felt off. I couldn't prove it. But I knew." "I believe you," Hang said softly, "and I'm going to finish what you started." There was a shaky breath on the other end of the line. "Thank you," Morrison whispered. "Thank you." Hang ended the call, slipped her phone back into her pocket and turned toward her team. "Run everything," Hang said firmly. "DNA, dental records, full forensic analysis. I want cause of death, time of burial, and any trace evidence we can salvage. And get me everything on a man named Calvin Dawson. Last known address, employment records, family connections. Everything, one of the techs glanced up from his notes. You think he's still alive? He'd be 83 now, Hang said, not looking up. So yeah, there's a chance the forensic team worked through the night. Floodlights cut through the darkness as evidence bags piled up. By morning, the first results came in. Victim 1, female, late 40s, blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. Single blow, instant death. Victim 2, male, early 50s, blunt force trauma to the skull, defensive wounds on both forearms. He'd fought back. Estimated time of death, late January 1970. Dental records confirmed what everyone already suspected. Harold James Chapman and Doris Marie Chapman. Murdered, buried, forgotten for 55 years. The story broke fast. Local stations ran it first. Bodies found in Genesee, 55-year-old cold case solved. Then came the national outlets, CNN, FOX, NBC. By the end of the week, it was everywhere. And in Grand Rapids, an 83-year-old man named Calvin Dawson sat alone in his living room, staring at the TV. When he saw the names Harold and Doris Chapman, his stomach turned to ice. He knew. They'd finally found them. Michigan State Police Forensic Lab. Lansing, the lab buzzed with quiet intensity. Stainless steel tables, latex gloves, the hum of fluorescent lights. Dr. Patricia Owens, forensic anthropologist, 23 years on the job, stood over two separate examination tables. Doris on the left, Harold on the right. She'd seen hundreds of skeletons. But something about this case, the deliberate burial, the intimacy of the violence, the passage of half a century, made her feel the weight of it. Doris's skull told a quiet story, a single blow to the posterior cranium. The fracture radiated outward in a spiderweb pattern, consistent with a heavy blunt object. A hammer, maybe, or a tire iron. Something swung with purpose. She never saw it coming. Harold's injuries were different, violent, chaotic. His skull bore similar trauma, but his forearms told the rest. Fractures in both ulnae, defensive wounds. He had tried to fight. Owens clicked on her recorder. Her voice was calm, clinical. Victim 1, female, approximately 45 to 50 years old. Single blunt force trauma to the occipital bone. No defensive wounds, likely attacked from behind. Death was instantaneous or near instantaneous. She paused, moved to the next table. Victim 2, male, approximately 50 to 55 years old. Multiple blunt force injuries to the parietal bone. Defensive fractures present on both forearms. Victim was conscious during assault. Cause of death, blunt force trauma resulting in catastrophic brain injury. She stopped the recorder and stepped back, taking in both tables. This wasn't random. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was personal. Someone had entered their home, struck Doris first, clean, efficient, then turned on Harold. He'd witnessed it, fought to protect his wife, and lost. Owen sent her report to Detective Hang within the hour. Hang read it twice. Her jaw tightened. Then she turned her attention to the rest of the evidence. The metal box had turned out to be a time capsule of truth. Decades underground had destroyed much of the fabric and paper inside, but not everything. Shreds of floral fabric, consistent with 1970s women's clothing, were preserved by the airtight seal. Fibers were carefully extracted and sent to analysis. The wedding ring was cataloged and cleaned. HD Forever gleamed clearly under the lab lights. But it was the box itself that drew Hang's attention. The carved initials weren't decorative. They were ownership marks, a habit among railway workers in the 60s and 70s, who often engraved their names or initials into their tools and equipment. Hang stared at the letters, heart beating faster. She'd seen them before. In the personnel files of a man named Calvin Dawson. It was common back then, engraving your initials into your tools or boxes. A simple way to keep thieves honest. You marked what was yours, and this box had been marked. The carved letters weren't random scratches. They were ownership. Someone had once claimed this box is theirs. The forensic team began dusting it for prints. Most of the surface was hopeless, too rusted, too corroded by decades underground. But inside the lid, shielded from the elements, they found something. A partial print. Right thumb. It wasn't much, maybe 60% of a full impression. But it was enough. They ran it through AFIS, the Michigan Automated Fingerprint Identification System. No match. Expanded the search to the national database. Still nothing. Detective Hang wasn't surprised. If our guy never got arrested, she said quietly, his prints wouldn't be in the system. But that didn't mean she was giving up. Hang turned to the thick folder Frank Morrison had left behind, the one filled with names, notes, and coffee-stained pages. She flipped through until she found the list. People who had keys to the Chapman home, railway employees, and neighbors who lived on Maple Street in 1970. One name appeared on every list. Hang pulled his current records. Age 83, address Grand Rapids, Michigan. Status, retired, widower. Criminal record, clean, still alive. She picked up the phone, called the Grand Rapids Police Department. I need eyes on this address, she said. Round-the-clock surveillance. Do not approach. Just watch, the officer on the other end asked. What exactly are we looking for? Hang didn't hesitate. A murderer. While the surveillance team got into position, Hang started connecting the dots. She dug up Dawson's old employment records, railway maintenance worker, hired in 1967 night shift. Quit in 1972, 2 years after the Chapmans vanished. She cross-referenced his work schedule against the timeline of the murders. He'd been on duty the weekend Harold and Doris disappeared. Worked Saturday night, off Sunday, back Monday. Plenty of time. Next, she went after his financial records. It took some digging. Banks from the 70s didn't digitize until decades later. But she found them. January 1970, Calvin Dawson was broke. $2,400 in debt. Behind on rent, barely scraping by. March 1970, debt cleared, paid in full, in cash. Hang leaned back in her chair, staring at the numbers. Where does a night shift railway worker suddenly get $2,400 in 1970? She pulled Harold Chapman's bank file. Savings account at Genesee Credit Union. Balance $12,000. That was real money back then. Enough to buy a house, a car, or retire early. Hang noticed something odd. A withdrawal attempt had been made in February 1970 for the entire balance. The slip was signed Harold Chapman, but the handwriting didn't match. The teller had caught it, flagged it as suspicious, and reported it to police. Morrison had investigated the lead back then, but it went cold. Now Hang saw it for what it was. Calvin Dawson had killed Harold and Doris Chapman for their money, tried to take it all, failed at the bank, then took whatever cash he could find in their house, enough to clear his debts, and walked away as if nothing happened. She needed proof. Hard scientific proof. Hang called the lab. I need a DNA comparison. Trace evidence from the victim's clothing matched to a known sample. The tech hesitated. Do we have a known sample? Not yet, she said, but I'll get one. 3 days later, 2 plainclothes officers sat in a car across the street from a quiet coffee shop in Grand Rapids. Calvin Dawson came in right on schedule, 83 years old, moving slow but steady. He ordered a coffee, sat by the window, and stared out at the world like an old man lost in thought. When he left, he didn't look back. The cup was still on the table, half full, faint ring of condensation on the rim. One of the officers slipped on gloves, bagged it carefully, and sent it straight to Lansing. 48 hours later, the lab called. Calvin Dawson's DNA was found on fibers from Doris Chapman's clothing. Hang stood in the lab, holding the report. Her hands were trembling. 55 years. 55 years this man had walked free. Not anymore. She picked up the phone and called the prosecutor's office. I need an arrest warrant, she said. Her voice didn't shake this time. Do you have enough? The prosecutor asked. Detective Sarah Hang looked at the mountain of evidence spread across her desk. DNA results, fingerprints, financial records, the timeline, and Frank Morrison's meticulous notes. She exhaled. Yeah, she said quietly. We've got him. The warrant was signed within hours. A chilly dawn settled over a quiet neighborhood in Grand Rapids. Police cruisers idled at both ends of the street. A small house sat in the center. White siding, peeling paint, the kind of place time had forgotten. Detective Hang stood at the door, her hand raised. 55 years of silence were about to break. She knocked. Footsteps shuffled on the other side, slow, uneven. The door opened. Calvin Dawson stood there, thin, pale, wearing a bathrobe and the look of a man who already knew why they'd come. "Calvin Douglas Dawson," Hang said, her voice firm but calm. "You're under arrest for the murders of Harold and Doris Chapman." For a heartbeat, he didn't move. He just stared at her, hollow-eyed, lost somewhere between past and present. Then in a voice that was almost a whisper, he said, "That was a lifetime ago." Not a denial, not confusion, just acceptance. "Turn around," Hang said, pulling out her cuffs. He obeyed. As the metal click shut around his wrists, she leaned close and said softly, "Frank Morrison says hello." Calvin Dawson's court-appointed public defender was Rebecca Marsh. 42, smart, overworked, underpaid, and juggling 3 other cases at once. Still, she took her job seriously, even when her clients were guilty. She sat across from Dawson in a small windowless room at the county jail. A stack of files sat between them, thick with evidence. "Mr. Dawson," she began, her tone professional but not unkind, "I need you to be honest with me. Did you kill Harold and Doris Chapman?" He didn't answer, just stared at the scratched metal table. "I can't help you if you don't talk to me," she said again. Silence. Rebecca sighed, opened a folder, and began reading aloud. "The evidence against you is substantial. DNA, fingerprints, financial records showing large debt payments right after their disappearance. And your own words to police, 'They shouldn't have trusted me.' That was a lifetime ago." She looked up. "A jury is going to hear all of that." Dawson's cuffed hands trembled slightly. "If you cooperate," Rebecca continued, "we might be able to negotiate, plead down to manslaughter, maybe argue diminished capacity due to your age or health. But I need something to work with finally," Dawson spoke, voice low, tired. "I needed the money." Rebecca froze. "What did you say?" "I needed the money," he repeated, staring at his hands. "I was drowning. Rent. Bills. I couldn't keep up." "So you killed them?" He didn't answer directly, just whispered, "They trusted me. They gave me a key. They thought I was their friend." Rebecca leaned forward. "Were you?" A long pause, then, "No." She wrote it down slowly. "Then tell me what happened that day." Dawson's eyes closed. His voice shook as he spoke. "I went over on a Sunday morning, told them I needed to borrow some tools. Doris was making coffee. Harold was reading the paper. I hit her first, from behind. She didn't see it coming." Rebecca's pen stopped moving. "Harold tried to fight," Dawson continued, emotion breaking through now. "He came at me. We struggled. I hit him too, multiple times. He wouldn't go down." "What did you use?" "A tire iron, from my truck." "Where is it now?" "I threw it in the river." 55 years ago, Rebecca sat back, heart pounding. This wasn't just a slip-up. This was a confession. Detailed, deliberate, real. "Why tell me this now?" she asked quietly. He opened his eyes, looked straight at her. "Because I'm 83. Because I'm tired. Because I've carried this for 55 years, and I can't anymore." She stared at him, choosing her words carefully. "You understand if you confess, you'll spend the rest of your life in prison. You'll die there." "I know." Rebecca closed her file slowly. "Then we'll enter a guilty plea. I'll argue for leniency based on your age and cooperation. But Mr. Dawson, you need to understand, this is a death sentence. Maybe not legally, but practically. You're not walking out of prison." Dawson gave a faint, sad smile. "I haven't walked free in 55 years, he said softly. "I've been in prison this whole time." Just nobody knew it but me. Rebecca sat silently for a moment. There was nothing to say. She reported the confession immediately to the prosecutor's office. But before charges could be finalized, a complication hit. Dawson's adult children had hired their own attorney, Gerald Finch, a polished, high-priced defense lawyer who specialized in protecting the elderly. Finch reviewed the files, listened to the confession tapes, and within a week filed a motion to suppress the confession. My client is 83 years old, barmaid Gerald Finch argued, his voice echoing through the courtroom. He has early-stage dementia, documented by his physician. He was interrogated without proper consideration for his mental state. His confession is unreliable. The prosecutor, Linda Cortez, stood without hesitation. A veteran with 25 years in homicide, she didn't bother to hide her frustration. He was read his rights, he requested counsel. The interrogation stopped immediately. His subsequent confession to his public defender was voluntary. And for the record, Your Honor, he's been deemed competent by 2 independent psychologists. Judge Patricia Rosenberg, known for her calm precision and zero patience for theatrics, reviewed the files in silence. Medical records, interrogation transcripts, competency evaluations. Finally, she looked up. "Motion denied," she said. "The confession stands. But given the defendant's age and health, I'm ordering a full medical evaluation before trial. If he's found incompetent, we'll revisit." The gavel fell. The evaluation took 2 weeks. 3 doctors examined Calvin Dawson. Cognitive tests, memory assessments, psychological evaluations. Their findings were unanimous. Early-stage dementia? Yes. But competent. Aware of the charges, able to assist in his defense. The trial would proceed. Finch adjusted his strategy. "We're pleading not guilty," he announced in court. Rebecca Marsh, the public defender who had earned Dawson's confession, was removed from the case. Finch took full control, and almost immediately, Dawson's story changed. In a pre-trial interview, Finch told reporters, "My client was coerced. He's an elderly man with memory issues. He was scared. He said what he thought the police wanted to hear, but he didn't kill anyone." Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. Finch smiled faintly, polished and confident. A man who knew how to control a narrative. Detective Hang watched the press conference from her office. The TV screen reflected in her coffee mug, her jaw tightening with every word. "He confessed," she said, half to herself, half to her partner. "He gave details only the killer would know." Her partner shrugged. "Doesn't matter. Finch will spin it, make the jury feel sorry for him." Hang knew he was right. This case, 55 years in the making, was about to get messy. Prosecutor Cortez built her case like an architect, layer by layer. The DNA, the fingerprints, the financial records, the timeline. Every piece leading back to Dawson. She lined up a team of experts, forensic anthropologists, DNA analysts, financial investigators. And she had Frank Morrison's files. 5 decades of obsession distilled into one conclusion. But Finch was no amateur. He went after the weak points, or at least the ones that looked weak under bright courtroom lights. "Where's the murder weapon?" he demanded during pretrial motions. "Where's the proof my client forged those bank signatures? Where's the witness who saw him commit this crime?" "Circumstantial evidence," Cortez replied, "but overwhelming. DNA doesn't lie. Fingerprints don't lie. Contamination," Finch shot back. "You're relying on 55-year-old evidence. How do we know it wasn't compromised?" Judge Rosenberg listened, eyes sharp, face unreadable. Then after a long pause, she made her ruling. "The evidence is admissible. The trial will proceed. Both sides will have the opportunity to present their case to the jury." The trial date was set, June 2nd, 2025. In the weeks leading up to it, the story exploded. True crime podcasts dissected every detail. Cable news ran nightly specials. Social media burned with opinion and outrage. Some saw Dawson as a monster who'd hidden in plain sight for half a century. Others saw a frail old man, confused, broken, possibly innocent. The community of Jesse, Michigan, where the Chapmans had lived, was divided. Elderly residents who remembered the victims wanted closure. Justice for Harold and Doris. They'd waited too long. But in Grand Rapids, Dawson's neighbors defended him. "He's a quiet man," one said to reporters. "He mows his lawn, feeds the birds. He's kind. This doesn't make sense." His own family was torn apart. His daughter released a statement. "We love our father. But if he did this, we can't defend it. We're praying for the truth." His son refused to comment. His grandchildren struggled in silence. trying to reconcile the gentle man who sent birthday cards and hugged them at Christmas with the accused murderer on the news. Detective Hang spent those weeks in restless preparation. Every file, every statement, every photo, reviewed again and again. She carried the weight of Morrison's decades-long pursuit, determined not to let it end in failure. One quiet afternoon, she drove to the cemetery. The sky was gray, the wind sharp. She stopped before Frank Morrison's grave, her mentor, the man who'd never given up on the Chapman's case. She stood there for a long time, then whispered, "We're almost there, Frank." Just a little longer, the leaves rustled softly, as if answering back. Hang closed her eyes, thinking of Harold and Doris Chapman, the couple who'd trusted the wrong man, the friends who'd welcomed him into their home on a Sunday morning, never knowing it would be their last. Detective Sarah Hang sat in her car, parked outside the courthouse, the weight of it all pressing down on her. She thought about Morrison, his obsession, his years of refusal to give up, even when everyone else had. And she thought about Calvin Dawson, a man who had killed two trusting people for money, buried them like garbage, and gone on living as if nothing had happened. But that ended now. The day before the trial, June 1st, Hang received a small brown package. The return address caught her attention immediately: Morrison's daughter. Inside was an old VHS tape, the label handwritten in fading ink, "For the trial, if it ever happens." Hang took the tape to the department's archive room, where an old player still sat on a shelf. She slid it in. The screen flickered, the sound hissed. And then there he was. Frank Morrison, younger, but still unmistakably himself. 70s maybe, seated in his cluttered basement, stacks of case files behind him. "My name is Frank Morrison," he began, his voice rough but steady. "I was the lead detective on the Chapman case in 1970. If you're watching this, it means the case has been solved. It means someone finally listened." He paused, eyes burning with the same conviction Hang had always admired. "I knew someone close to them did this. I knew it in my bones. Calvin Dawson had access. He had motive. He had opportunity. I couldn't prove it then, but I never stopped believing it." He leaned closer to the camera. "Harold and Doris Chapman were good people. They didn't deserve what happened to them. And whoever is prosecuting this case, don't let him get away with it. Not again." The screen went black. Hang sat there for a long time, the silence heavy. Morrison's voice echoed in her head. "Don't let him get away with it." Then she stood, picked up the phone, and called Linda Cortez. "I have something you need to see." The Jassy County Circuit Courthouse was packed, every seat taken. The overflow room down the hall had standing room only. Outside, news vans lined the block, satellite dishes pointing skyward, cameras trained on the courthouse doors. This wasn't just a trial. It was the closing of a 55-year-old wound. Inside courtroom 3, the air was thick with tension. Judge Patricia Rosenberg presided from the bench, her gavel resting within easy reach, her expression unreadable. To her left sat 12 jurors, 8 women, 4 men, ages ranging from their late 20s to late 60s. Not one of them had been alive in 1970. At the prosecution table, Linda Cortez sat flanked by her assistants and Detective Hang. Their table was a fortress of files, binders, and carefully labeled evidence boxes. Across from them, at the defense table, sat Calvin Dawson, frail, gray, his suit hanging loose around his thin frame. His attorney, Gerald Finch, looked calm and self-assured, every inch the polished professional. Dawson stared straight ahead, expression blank, as if the world unfolding around him wasn't his. Judge Rosenberg lifted her gavel. "We're on the record. The people of Michigan versus Calvin Douglas Dawson. 2 counts of second-degree murder." She nodded toward the prosecution. "Ms. Cortez, your opening statement." Linda Cortez rose, buttoned her blazer, and stepped to the center of the courtroom. She looked at the jurors, one by one, her voice steady and clear. 55 years ago, she began, Harold and Doris Chapman were murdered in their home. They were beaten to death with a tire iron, their bodies buried in shallow graves near the railway tracks. She paused, letting the words hang in the air. For 55 years, their families had no answers. Their community had no closure, and their killer lived a quiet, unremarkable life. believing he had gotten away with it. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Cortez didn't flinch. But he didn't. Because evidence doesn't lie, DNA doesn't forget, and justice, even when delayed, will not be denied. She walked to the evidence table and lifted a framed photograph of Harold and Doris Chapman, smiling, alive, the way they deserved to be remembered. These were good people, she said softly. Hard-working, kind. They gave the defendant a key to their home. They trusted him as a neighbor, maybe even as a friend, and he betrayed that trust in the most horrific way imaginable. She set the photo down and lifted another item, a picture of the rusted toolbox, initials carved into its lid. This, she said, is where Doris Chapman's body was found. Inside the defendant's toolbox, buried 4 feet underground, her skull fractured, her wedding ring still on her finger, Cortez held up the ring. The small, tarnished band catching the courtroom light. The room went still. Harold fought back, she continued. His forearms were broken from trying to protect his wife. But he couldn't, because the defendant was younger, stronger, and armed. She turned toward Dawson. The defendant needed money. He was in debt, desperate. So he killed 2 innocent people, took their cash, and tried to steal more from their bank account. Cortez let the silence stretch. Then she took a slow breath, faced the jury again, and said quietly, "This case is about trust, about betrayal, and about justice, 55 years overdue." She returned to her seat. Calvin Dawson's daughter sat in the gallery, tears brimming. "My father is a good man," she said softly to a reporter before the court resumed. "He's not capable of this." And then, against his attorney's advice, Calvin Dawson took the stand. The courtroom fell silent. You could hear the faint hum of the air vents, the rustle of paper as he made his slow, trembling walk to the witness box. He was sworn in, took a seat, and faced the jury. 12 strangers who now held his life in their hands. Defense attorney Gerald Finch stood, buttoning his jacket. "Mr. Dawson," he began evenly, "did you kill Harold and Doris Chapman?" Dawson's voice was barely a whisper. "No." "Did you bury their bodies?" "No." "Do you know how your DNA ended up on Doris Chapman's clothing?" He hesitated, fumbling for words. I don't know. Maybe I helped her once, carried groceries, fixed something. I don't remember. Do you remember confessing to your public defender?" Dawson looked down. "I was scared," he said quietly. "I said what I thought they wanted to hear." Finch nodded, satisfied. No further questions. Prosecutor Linda Cortez rose slowly, her gaze locked on Dawson. She approached the stand, her tone calm but pointed. "Mr. Dawson," she said, "you claim you don't remember confessing? Yet in that confession, you describe specific details that were never released to the public. You said you hit Doris from behind. You said Harold fought back. You said you used a tire iron. How did you know those things if you didn't do it?" Dawson stammered, I must have heard it somewhere. On the news, maybe." Cortez's voice sharpened. "The details of the injuries were never made public." Silence. "You also said, and I quote, 'They shouldn't have trusted me.' What did you mean by that?" I don't know. I was confused." "And you said I needed the money." "What money, Mr. Dawson?" "I don't remember saying that." Cortez lifted a transcript, reading aloud. "I needed the money. I was drowning." "Those are your words. What money were you talking about?" Dawson's face turned pale. "I don't know." "You don't know," she repeated, her voice steady. "Or you don't want to say." "I don't remember." Cortez leaned closer, her tone cutting but controlled. "You remember enough to say you didn't do it, but not enough to remember confessing? Or the details only the killer would know? Convenient, isn't it?" "I'm old," Dawson said, his voice cracking. "I'm confused." Cortez nodded slowly. "You're 83 now, yes. But you were 28 when Harold and Doris were murdered. You weren't confused then, were you?" "I didn't kill them," he said, shaking his head. "Then why," she pressed, "is your DNA on Doris's clothing? Why are your fingerprints on the toolbox she was buried in? Why did your debts disappear right after the Chapmans vanished?" Dawson said nothing. Cortez stepped back, voice low but certain. "You killed them! You know it. I know it. And this jury knows it. Objection, Finch shouted. Sustained, Judge Rosenberg said firmly. Ms. Cortez, stick to questions. Cortez straightened her blazer. No further questions, Your Honor. Dawson left the stand, his face ashen, shoulders sagging under the weight of the truth he still wouldn't admit. 2 days later came closing arguments. Cortez was powerful, measured, her voice carrying the gravity of 55 years. She walked the jury through each piece of evidence, the DNA, the fingerprints, the confession, the money trail. He had the means, she said. He had the motive. He had the opportunity, and he confessed. Don't let him hide behind age and confusion. Harold and Doris Chapman deserved justice. Finch countered with passion of his own. He hammered the concept of reasonable doubt. If you have even the smallest doubt, he told the jury, you must acquit. That's the law. And there is plenty of doubt here. Evidence decades old, memories faded, tests that could have been compromised. The courtroom was still when he sat down. The jury deliberated for 11 hours over 2 long days. On June 28th, the foreman stood as the judge asked the question that had waited 55 years for an answer. Has the jury reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor. In the matter of second-degree murder in the death of Doris Chapman, how do you find? A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. And in the matter of second-degree murder in the death of Harold Chapman, how do you find? Calvin Dawson's head dropped. His daughter sobbed. Detective Sarah Hang closed her eyes, a slow, heavy breath escaping her lips. 55 years. Finally. Frank Morrison never saw the verdict. He passed away on May 3, 2025, just weeks before the trial began. 98 years old. But he died knowing. His daughter had been at his bedside when Detective Hang called with the news of Dawson's arrest. She'd held the phone to his ear. Morrison, frail and fading, managed a small smile. I knew it, he whispered. I always knew. Those were some of his last words. At his funeral, his family spoke of a man who had given everything for justice, a man who refused to let time bury the truth. Because to Frank Morrison, Harold and Doris Chapman weren't just names in an old file. They were people who deserved to be remembered. And finally they were. He carried that case with him every single day for 55 years. At Frank Morrison's memorial, his son stood at the podium, voice thick with emotion. It consumed him, he said, pausing to collect himself. But he was right. And now, finally, he can rest. 3 months after the verdict, the Yacy Police Department held a small ceremony in his honor. Inside the station lobby, right near the entrance where every officer would walk past it each day, they unveiled a bronze plaque. It read, beneath the inscription was a black and white photo of Morrison from 1970, standing outside the Chapman house, notebook in hand, that steady determination in his eyes. Detective Sarah Hang attended the ceremony. She stood quietly in front of that plaque for a long time, lost in thought, thinking about the man who had started this fight, and about the 2 people who had waited 55 long years for someone to finish it. On August 2, 2025, Harold and Doris Chapman were finally laid to rest. The memorial service was held at Yacy Community Church, the same church they'd attended every Sunday back in 1970. The same wooden pews, the same soft light filtering through the stained glass, the same quiet reverence that once marked their lives. Over 200 people filled the sanctuary, elderly neighbors who remembered the Chapmans, local families who'd followed the case, investigators who had worked to solve it, even members of Morrison's family who came to pay their respects to the man who never gave up. At the pulpit, the Reverend spoke with a calm, steady voice. 55 years ago, he said, Harold and Doris Chapman disappeared from this community. For 55 years, we wondered, we prayed, and we hoped for answers. And now, at long last, they've come home. He looked over the congregation. Harold and Doris were good people. They lived quiet, humble lives. They trusted their neighbors. They believed in kindness. And that trust was betrayed in the most unimaginable way. But today, he said, his voice warming, we remember them. We honor them. And we lay them to rest with the dignity they always deserved. After the service, the caskets were carried to Evergreen Cemetery, just outside of town. They were placed side by side beneath a large oak tree, simple, peaceful, timeless. Their headstones read, Beloved Husband, 1918, 1970, Beloved Wife, 1921, 1970. People lingered long after the ceremony ended. Some left flowers. Others stood quietly, heads bowed, honoring two people they'd never met, but would never forget. Among them was Mrs. Patterson's granddaughter. Her grandmother had passed years earlier, but she still remembered the stories. My grandma talked about them until the day she died, she said softly. She always said something wasn't right. I'm glad she was heard back in Yacy. The old red brick house on Maple Street still stands. A young couple lives there now, with two children. They'd had no idea about the home's dark history when they bought it. But after the trial, after the documentaries and the news stories, they learned. At first, they were horrified. Then they did something unexpected. They reached out to the community and asked if it would be appropriate to place a small memorial on the property. The response was overwhelming. Yes, please, Harold and Doris should be remembered. So they did. Today, a modest plaque sits in the front yard, near the walkway. It reads, In memory of Harold and Doris Chapman, who lived here and were taken too soon. May they rest in peace. It's become a quiet landmark. People drive by slowly. Some stop to take a photo. Others leave flowers or stand in silence. The house isn't a place of mystery anymore. It's a place of remembrance, a reminder of justice finally done, and of a community's ability to heal. As for Calvin Dawson, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The day after the verdict, his three children released a joint statement. We are devastated. We loved our father, but we cannot defend his actions. What he did was unforgivable. We pray for the Chapman family, for the community of Yacy, and for everyone affected by this tragedy. We hope this verdict brings some measure of peace. His grandchildren struggled the most. One of them, a college student, wrote on social media, How do you reconcile the grandfather who taught you to ride a bike with a man who murdered two innocent people? I don't have an answer. I don't know if I ever will. Calvin Dawson now lives out his days in a state correctional facility in southern Michigan, confined to the medical unit because of his age and declining health. And in Yacy, life has moved on, slowly, quietly, with memory and mercy intertwined. He'll likely die there. Calvin Dawson has never spoken publicly since the trial. The case of Harold and Doris Chapman became a turning point, not just for Yacy, but for the entire state of Michigan. Because what began as one detective's obsession in 1970 became proof that no case is ever truly cold. Advances in forensic science, DNA analysis, fingerprint databases, even ground-penetrating radar, have shown that time doesn't always erase the truth. It just buries it deeper. And sometimes all it takes is one person who refuses to stop digging. After the Dawson verdict, the Michigan State Police Cold Case Unit received increased funding. More investigators were hired, more dormant files were reopened, and families who had been waiting decades for answers finally had hope. Detective Sarah Hang was promoted soon after. She continues to work cold cases to this day, inspired by Frank Morrison's legacy. Every victim deserves someone who won't forget them, she said in an interview. Frank Morrison taught me that. The story of Harold and Doris Chapman is a powerful reminder that evil can hide in plain sight, sometimes for decades. That trust can be weaponized by those with dark intentions. That a quiet neighbor, a friendly face, or a helping hand can sometimes conceal the unthinkable. But it's also a reminder of something deeper. That justice, even when delayed by 55 years, still matters. That persistence from people like Frank Morrison can outlast generations. That communities never truly forget. And that two people, erased from the world in 1970, are now remembered, honored, and finally at peace. Harold and Doris Chapman waited 55 years for justice, and in the end, they got it. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. It really helps more people find these stories. Share it with someone who loves true crime, and subscribe if you haven't already. We upload new cases every single week, stories of justice, redemption, and truth that refuses to die. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you think cold cases should ever be officially closed, or should investigators keep fighting for answers, no matter how much time has passed? I'll be reading every single one of your comments. Thank you for watching, and remember, justice may sleep, but it never forgets.